We're in 1 Timothy 3, and what he must be to be a deacon, or to be a deacon in my church, or to be one of our deacons. This is the third part of that little mini series or whatever. And for those guys, maybe they're breathing a sigh of relief. Okay, no more sermons about us. Even though I think, to be honest, I think the sermons have been pretty positive for those guys, because it couldn't have come at a better time. When I wrote these messages, I'm probably just thinking from a theological perspective, and the time I've actually got to preach these messages is coming right after seeing these guys really come together and just seeing their work happen. So I think it's almost of God, that God could even use something like the church getting flooded to really kind of help me, even in my mindset, to be able to speak in a more practical way about our deacons and the positive work they've done. Because that probably isn't getting included in the sermon. I'm just thinking in terms of text. I'm just thinking in terms of, just explaining what's in the passage. And the first sermon is really a week after seeing these guys and their function here in the body. So God could even use something like a flood. God could use a flood of the church as something that's good for the congregation. Of course, he used the flood as something that was good for all of humanity in the early chapters of Genesis 6 through 9. But anyway, it is no secret. I've made it no secret in the last several weeks that I've had some negative experiences when it comes to the role of pastor and deacon. And most of that happened because of a misunderstanding of a role of a deacon in a church. And that misunderstanding is prevalent in churches like ours, where churches like ours, sometimes people are thinking about the church almost more like being deacon-led churches rather than pastor-led churches. And when that happens, there are problems. Some of the problems that I've seen or even experienced in the past have come from deacons who misunderstood that role, or who were disqualified on some other matter. And what I'm going to say is that oftentimes those two things kind of go hand in hand. So a deacon who misunderstands his role often is disqualified on some other matter. And you don't always necessarily find out about it right up in beforehand, but you do find out about it. So qualified deacons and understanding the role of a deacon oftentimes also goes hand in hand. So if you have a guy who understands the biblical role of deacon, the chances of him being biblically qualified, just seem exponentially higher in my mind. But anyway, when I think of today's message, this third part, and we're going to deal with some things like the deacon's home, I can't help but think about at least one deacon who served. And this guy was otherwise disqualified, and the church generally knew that. But his wife and his family made it abundantly clear. Even if he was qualified on all other accounts, if he was qualified on everything that we read in this passage, he was disqualified when it came to his home. And yet he was serving as a deacon in a fundamental Baptist church. And that is sometimes the case. Sometimes you can have some very able men who can serve as deacons, but their wives disqualify them, or their homes disqualify them. The way they manage their home disqualifies them. And those are really kind of two of the key issues that are coming up in today's passage. 1 Timothy 3, verses 11 through 13. I would just recommend that you turn there, because we'll be in that passage a little bit. We'll move over to Titus 2 at one point, but 1 Timothy 3, verses 11 through 13, we're going to see, the first idea that we're going to see there is that deacons' wives have certain qualifications that need to be met. Deacons' wives have qualifications. Look at 1 Timothy 3, verse 11. Their wives must likewise be dignified, not malicious gossips, but temperate, faithful in all things. Now, anyone's Bible there say women and not their wives? Anyone's Bible say women? I see a hand. Verse 11. Anyone's Bible say women must likewise be dignified? I see another hand. 3 hands. I see about 3 hands out there. 4. So that's the way the New American Standard translates. If you're reading from the New American Standard, you're going to see women there. Now, I would argue, and I can argue this. I'm not going to waste this morning really arguing that theological point. But the passage, I'll give you just the tip of the iceberg. The passage is clearly not referring to female deacons, but to deacons' wives. The tip of the iceberg argument that I'll explain to you. So there's a lot that goes into translating work. All right. So you look at what a word, you look at the range of a word, right? So the word for women is the same word for wives, right? So there's a range of definitions that you could use. But what you cannot ignore is context. Context is perhaps the most important factor when it comes to translating, right? So here in this paragraph, verses 8 through 10 are talking about male deacons, right? Very clearly. Verses 12 and 13 are talking about male deacons. But now verse 11 is supposed to be talking about women deacons? And that would beg a whole bunch of different questions like, well, do the qualifications in verses 8 through 10 and in verse 12 and 13, do they apply to the women too, or do they just apply to the men? No, listen, we're dealing with deacons' wives. There is no question about it contextually that we're dealing with deacons' wives. We translate on the basis of context. The King James is right on this verse. That's for you, Tom, and for you, Paul. Both you guys are right in line, right? Right in line with each other. Like the stars are aligned, the King James fans out there. The King James is right in this verse. The New King James is right in how it translates this verse. The English Standard Version is correct in how it translates this verse. The New American Standard Version has translated this incorrectly. And so you've got to look at the original language and you've got to look at context. That's what I'm going to say there. Nevertheless, deacons' wives, they are critical to a deacon's ministry, just as the pastor's wife is critical to his ministry. Notice what Paul writes about these wives in verse 11. Their wives must be dignified. Dignified. The same word that's used back in verse 8 about the deacon. So the deacon needs to be dignified. Deacons' wives need to be dignified. Deacons are supposed to be men who are worthy of dignity and respect. Women are also worthy. Their wives are also worthy of respect. The husband respects them. Their children respects them. The people of the church respects them. They are dignified. They are worthy of respect. That's the first word there. They must be dignified. They must not be malicious gossips. That's the next thing we see there. They must not be malicious gossips. Now, the word in the original language for malicious gossips there is, I'm going to say the word and see if anyone knows what that word means. Diabolos. Anyone know? Anyone want to take a guess what that typically is? How that's typically translated? Diabolos. What's that? Is that Paul? Is that you? Can you say a little more loud? Loud. Devil. Diabolos. Devil. Right? Like a little, like, you know, I'm a Rangers fan, right? No Christian should ever root for the New Jersey Devils. It's just, you shouldn't. Come on. How can you root for a devil? Anyway, it means devils, right? Little devils. So that's the word. That's the word that's used oftentimes for the devil, and it means a slanderer, right? He is a slanderer. That's this word. They are not to be slanderers. They're not to be little devils, right? We're talking about slander, someone who destroys the reputation of another person by means of how they speak about that person. That happens. That happens a lot in churches. Happens a lot in churches. It is appropriately translated here in the New American Standard as malicious gossips. Malicious gossips. Now, why would I say that's an appropriate translation and not just gossip, not just gossips or slanderers? Why malicious gossips? Why do I think that's appropriate? Anyone want to offer? Tom? Generally speaking, right, maybe without exception, gossip is with intent to harm, right? It's malicious, right? That's what it means, right? To intent to harm. Gossip by its very nature is often malicious. Paul is going to write against malicious gossips in his second letter to Timothy, even. In 2 Timothy 2, we won't read that today. Rather than being malicious gossips, Paul, he's going to write later on to another pastor, Pastor Titus, about what women should be like in the church. And so if you could keep your finger here, 1 Timothy 3, and just turn over to Titus chapter 2 for a second. We'll spend just a couple minutes here, maybe a minute or two, and 3 or 4 minutes maybe, in Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2. Verses 3 through 5. I'd put it on the wall, but no. We can't use a projector out here. Titus 2, 3 through 5. Paul's writing to Titus, another pastor, about what women should be like in the church. And he writes this, Titus chapter 2, verse 3. Older women likewise are to be reverent in their behavior, not malicious gossips or enslaved to much wine. So Paul is calling for mature women to be respectful in their behavior. He writes against malicious gossip, against substance abuse. Not malicious gossips, nor enslaved to much wine, teaching what is good. So there's an instructive element of these older women in the church, teaching what is good so that they may encourage the young women to, now this is the content of their teaching. They're teaching what is good so that they're encouraging these young women, or with the result of teaching these younger women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their own husbands. You know, in America, that's a bad thing. You know, we're the land of the empowered, strong, independent woman who submits to no man. That's where we are in America right now, right? But you know, in many, many, many other parts of the world, pretty much every Muslim nation that exists, and other countries, places like Nigeria and stuff like that, where it's a good thing for a wife to submit to her husband, where they actually where the government will do like a premarital counseling for a marriage and tell them that you must submit to your husband. Tell a wife you must submit to your husband. All right. Here? Are you kidding me? They'll plaster me. If the wrong feminist if the wrong feminist would hear me say these words, I'd be plastered all over the internet, right? Look at this bigot, look at this sexist, right? Because of the feminist movement and how strong its roots are here in America, and how much the church has been influenced by it and doesn't even know it. There are so many American women who don't even realize how influenced they've been by feminist culture, even in sometimes the way they dress. Hillary Clinton popularized the pantsuit as a way of declaring strong, independent feminism. We don't even realize it. We don't even think about it. We're not even thinking about that, right? But we've been even subtly influenced by the heavily feminist, the strong feminist movement here in America. Anyway, let's get back to verse 5. To be sensible, pure, workers at home, kind, being subject to their husbands. These are the things that the older women are to teach the younger women. And look at the result. Look at the purpose at the end of verse 5. So that the word of God will not be dishonored. The feminist movement dishonors the word of God. It dishonors it. Too often, older women are models of what not to be in a congregation, rather than being a model of what to be and teaching the younger generation. I know I said a couple minutes. I went a little longer than I wanted to on this passage here, but too often the older women are models of what not to be. They often pull back and become less committed in their older years. They sometimes I've heard the word retire from church service. This is not godliness. This is not a godly example. This is not a godly model. This is a model of what not to be. Sometimes I'll hear older ladies, or I've heard older ladies in the past say things like, you get older, you get worn out, and you just can't do church as much. You just can't serve in the church like you used to. I'm going to tell you, I've seen some older ladies in churches who would put many younger men to shame in their service, okay, and younger women to shame in their service. I think of Sandy Thornton, right? What was she? 68, 69, 70 when she was here? Paul, you probably know, right? You know how old she was when Pastor Thornton left? He was 70, so she was right around the same age, right? I don't know if she was was she a little older than him, I think? A little younger. You don't know. He doesn't know. He doesn't know. Anyway, let's say 70. Let's say 70 for the sake of the argument. She worked more than anyone in our church works here today. She was busy about the work of the Lord. And Mrs. Thornton, if you're listening from home, you know the church appreciate. Hey, listen, it was hard. It was hard to recover the amount. We needed multiple people to recover the amount of work that she did by herself. Anyone who is here, can you verify that? She did the work of multiple people. And so don't tell me when you get old, you get tired. And I understand you get old, but you don't retire from the work of the Lord. Older women are called to be models for the younger women. When older women don't do that, younger women are being robbed of that model. Deacons' wives are to be such a model. Maybe they won't be necessarily as old, right? And that's not a bad thing, right? But they can be that model even in younger years. They can be, and they are. Whether they want to or not, they are a model in the congregation, hopefully for good. They must be for good, model for good. Deacons' wives are to be worthy of respect, not malicious gossips. Now, if you could turn back to 1 Timothy. Sorry, it was a little longer than I said. I said some things I wasn't planning on saying, but whatever. So she must be dignified. Their wives must be dignified, not malicious gossips. Look at the next thing it says in verse 11, 1 Timothy 3:11. She also must be temperate. The word speaks of having self-control, of being level-headed, of being sober-minded. It's the same word that's used in verse 2 about pastors. Pastors were to be sober-minded, self-controlled, level-headed. Well, so must deacons' wives. Now, why do you think that would be the case? I'll tell you exactly why. Because I've experienced it in my house. Is when you get criticized and your wife hears you get criticized, she's got to be level-headed. Because, the claws can come out. You know what I mean? Like, I can't believe... Roxanne has fought with emotions when people have criticized me or have been unfair against me or have lied about me. Now, she has to be sober-minded. She has to be self-controlled because here she's hearing perhaps even a friend of hers slander her husband. Well, you think that's going to make a woman emotional? You think it makes a man emotional? You better believe it, right? So you've got to be sober-minded. So if you have a deacon who is in a position of respect, in a position of leadership, and he's being spoken against, you better believe the wife needs to be able to be sober-minded in that situation. Finally, in verse 11, they are to be faithful in all things. She must be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, and that means she needs to be faithful to the Word of God. She needs to be faithful to the worship of the local church. She's a person you could rely upon. She's a person who's trustworthy, and she, like that Titus 2 role model, is to serve as a model for the other ladies of the church. So that's kind of the first let's imagine you don't have that. Let's imagine that you have a deacon's wife who's not this. She's not a godly example. She's not committed to the Word of God and to prayer. She's not committed to the worship of the local church. Instead, she is a malicious gossip. Think that's going to be an attribute to the local church? Think that's going to be a good thing for the local church? Think that's going to be an attribute to her husband's ministry in the local church? You think he's going to be distracted by his ungodly wife? Do you think the church is going to feel the effects of that? I'm going to tell you right now, the church will feel the effects of it because the church has felt the effects of that here in the past. It'll mess with the deacon's work. It'll mess with the work of the ministry. And so a deacon's wife must meet the biblical qualifications. A deacon's home also needs to meet those qualifications. Look at verse 12. 1 Timothy 3, verse 12. Deacons must be husbands of only one wife and good managers of their children and their own households. And so just like the pastor, the deacons need to be moral in the sexual realm. They need to be, it says here, husbands of only one wife. And again, wife, the same word for woman, it's the same word for wife, right? We would argue that the best way to translate this is one woman man. They must be faithful to their wives. This is not, and I said this during the sermon on the pastor. I don't remember if it was part 2 or part 3. They must be faithful to their wives. It's not a character issue. It's not a status issue. It's a character issue. So we're not talking about this guy has been married to only one woman at a time. That is, it's not a statement against polygamy. It's not that he even must be married. The Apostle Paul wasn't married, and he's serving as a pastor in a local church, or he's functioning as a pastor. It's not saying that he must only have one wife throughout his whole life necessarily. We've got to stop thinking of this as a status and start thinking of it contextually as a character issue. This is a character issue, not a status issue. This is a character issue, not a status. Did I say that enough times? Did you get that? Right? We're dealing with a person's character as a one-woman man in the original language, not as a status issue. He's a one-woman man. And so that holds him to an even greater qualification than the status of being married to one wife throughout his life. You know, a guy who's married to one wife throughout his whole life, he can be a terrible, terrible person morally. He can fantasize about other women. He can pleasure himself to the thoughts of other women. He can view pornography. He can flirt with other women. That's not a one-woman man. It's not about status. It's about character. We have a man here who is a one-woman man who is satisfied only in his wife. He's a one-woman man. He doesn't fantasize about women. He doesn't view pornography. He doesn't flirt with other women. He's a one-woman man. And so that begs the question, can a man be divorced and serve as a deacon in a church? And I would say, if we're understanding this passage properly, then certainly he could. Certainly he could. Perhaps he could. But only if his character has proven, not status necessarily, but character, only if his character has proven that he is a one-woman man. And that's not something that happens overnight. That's not something that happens overnight. It's not something that happens even in a few years. It can take many years, even decades to display, given the mark of divorce. So I'm not the type of guy who would say, hey, look, let's put it this way. It is an exception rather than the rule. That would be my view. It is a rare exception that stands the test of time. An exception that displays a person's long-standing character. That's how Pastor Thornton held. That's what he held to. It's what I'm holding to. A person we're dealing with a character. It's what Dr. Huss held to, and several people down at the seminary. They were convinced that this is one woman, man in the original language. A deacon must be a one-woman man. And it's something that if the mark of divorce is on a person's life, would take many, many, many years, if not decades, to show that he is a one-woman man. And that happens. That happens. There are good men who prove themselves to be one-woman man in spite of the mark of divorce on their lives. That happens. That happens. You think about a situation where a man is with a woman and the woman is not acting in godliness and she leaves her husband. She leaves her husband. And the guy didn't do anything wrong. She leaves her husband. And, now he's got a mark on his life, a mark of divorce on his life. He didn't even do anything wrong. And over the next many years and decades, shows himself to be a one-woman man. Yeah, I'd have a hard time judging that guy. I'd have a hard time looking at that guy saying that guy's character doesn't stand up because of the actions of someone else. You understand what I'm saying? We're looking at this in terms of character, not in terms of status, in terms of character. Now, why should a deacon be a one-woman man? In practical terms, a deacon, like a pastor, is often put in places of trust with women. Now, they're not spiritual leaders in that their primary responsibilities are doing counseling or preaching or something like that, right? It's not that even members in the congregation are told. We never see in the Bible, we never see one time that members of the congregation are to submit to deacons. We don't see that. So the position with women is a little bit different than that of a pastor, for sure. But I don't think any of us can really argue the point that a person who's serving as a deacon is serving in a position of leadership in the local church. Okay? And so there's spiritual integrity connected with the office. And the spiritual integrity connected with being a deacon leaves sometimes unsuspecting women in a position of vulnerability. Sometimes it works the other way. Sometimes, I'll give you a couple scenarios. There's a woman perhaps who finds herself wishing that her husband was a godly man. Do we ever have that in churches? You ever have women who, a common story that I've seen, and this is to the detriment of men. This is not a sexist statement or anything. This is to the detriment of man, is that oftentimes we'd see women who were faithful to the Lord and men who weren't. Now, in our church, we sometimes see the opposite of that, and, we've sometimes seen that in the past as well, right? So, it works both ways. But it's often been seen a faithful woman, a woman who prays, a woman who reads the Bible, and the man's not really that interested in spiritual things. In a situation like that, a woman can become discontent in her marriage. Now, that's trouble. That's trouble for her, right? That's certainly trouble. That says something about her spiritual walk. But she becomes discontent in her husband. In her marriage, she begins to see a trusted leader in the church and wishes that her husband was more like that leader. And she admires that person's spiritual maturity, and that can draw her to him and make her vulnerable to his advances. And so he must be a one-woman man to prevent situations like that. The situation can be more depraved than that. It can be a woman who's attracted to power, and she considers a deacon a person of power, and completely misunderstands the role of a deacon or the role of a pastor for that matter, because a pastor is a servant and a deacon is a servant. And she sees a pastor as a powerful man, and you say, that doesn't happen in churches. It does happen because there are ungodly people in churches. Who says everyone in churches is a Christian? Must be out of your mind if you think everyone in church is a Christian. Must be out of your mind. There's all types of lost people in sound churches that act like lost people in sound churches. And so don't tell me there wouldn't be a woman in a church who desires power, a powerful man, and misunderstands what that even is. Misunderstands what spiritual leadership is. Not a position of power, a position of service. And is attracted to a position of power and makes advances to the man in a position of quote-unquote power and develops feelings for him. Before long, that can be trouble if the guy is not a one-woman man. Oftentimes, it ends up being the opposite situation where the man is the one making the advances. Spiritual leader preys upon an unsuspecting woman, perhaps becomes an advisor or a counselor in her life, essentially becomes the woman's rock and uses that in order to make sexual advances This stuff happens all the time. It happened with one of my former seminary professors. Happened with Jimmy Swaggart, and I think Jim Baker, and a few of these other TV people. Of course, my seminary professor, he repented. He did repent eventually. This is why it is utterly essential that any biblical officer be trustworthy with women. It's why it's essential that any deacon be a one-woman man. A deacon's character is a reflection of the church, and it's vital that he be sexually moral. Here are some guidelines to put into practice, men and women, when it comes to this. Men and women should not be close friends. Let me explain what I mean by that. It is dangerous. Listen, when I was lost, the popular movie, popular romantic comedy, rom-com, I like romantic comedies. Popular rom-com of the day was When Harry Met Sally, right? Anyone here see When Harry Met Sally? And one of the big arguments of When Harry Met Sally, I haven't seen it in probably 20 years or longer maybe, so I don't remember. But I remember something like one of the popular arguments was that men and women can't be friends, right? I think that's what Billy Crystal, is that his name, Billy Crystal? He was a Yankee fan. Billy Crystal, that's his name, right? That's what Billy Crystal's character would say to Meg Ryan. Say, men and women can't be friends. She said, yeah, of course they could be friends. And before long, they weren't friends, right? Men and women should not be close friends. I can be friends with a woman that is more than acquaintances, but I can't be close friends with a woman. I don't have regular phone conversations with any woman. I'll do some counseling. I prefer to do counseling over the phone, right? But I'll only counsel so often, and then I have to kind of pass them on to someone else, because I don't want there to be any dependence that's developed. I don't want a woman to become dependent upon me in her life, unless it's my wife. So I don't typically call women in the church. I do sometimes for little things, but for the most part, I have my wife do it. I'll ask my wife to call some of the ladies of the church. Ladies, many of you have gotten phone calls from my wife or texts from my wife, right? Sometimes that's something I'll ask her to do. That's kind of an extension of my pastoral ministry. If my wife is busy and I don't want to wait, or it's something small, I'll make the call or I'll shoot out a text or whatever. But most of the time, I have my wife take care of that. I don't develop close friendships with women, like super close. I'll develop a close friendship with their husband. My marriage can develop close friendships with their marriage. That is, my wife and I can develop close friendships with them as a couple, but I can't develop close friendships with the woman, if that makes sense. Another guideline to consider is a man should never be alone with a woman who's not his wife. Should never be alone with a woman who is not your wife. This is true for pastors, for deacons, or for anyone else for that matter. If it's your daughter or something like that, okay, that's fine. But you shouldn't be alone with another woman. You can be completely innocent and still get into trouble. Do we have any biblical examples of a guy who was completely innocent, found himself alone with a woman who she was terrible. This woman was terrible. Anyway, I found himself alone with a terrible woman, a terrible sexual woman, right? Who didn't care about her marriage and found himself in trouble. I give you a lot of hints here, so you should pretty much know, like right off the bat. Any example biblically of that? What's that? And Joseph, and the woman's name was? Potiphar's wife. Yeah, we don't really know her name. We just know Potiphar's wife, right? So Joseph didn't do anything wrong. He's alone with a woman who traps him. And he ends up in jail. His reputation ends up destroyed, and he didn't even do anything wrong. So that's what's often called the Billy Graham rule, right? Whatever, we talked about that before. But so you should never be alone with a woman who's not your wife. If I have to do counseling with a woman, I make sure that someone else is around. Okay, so right now it's easy. They come to my house, and we'll go in the back room there, and my wife can come in at any time. Oftentimes she's there, and the kids are out, doing something else. right? So my wife is there, and that is a level of protection for me. I'm protecting my marriage, and I'm protecting that person's marriage too. A lot of times people think, oh, it couldn't happen to me. I couldn't fall. Well, no one who's saved thinks, one day I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna commit infidelity. No one just wakes up and thinks, one day I'm gonna go cheat on. No, it's a subtle thing that happens. And Satan is deceptive, and sin is deceptive, and it's powerful, and it creeps up on you. And before you know it, these little innocent things that you could do could result in trouble. So you have to set up guidelines, you have to set barriers to be safe. A deacon needs to protect himself. He needs to protect his marriage. He also needs to manage his household well. Look at verse 12. Deacons must be one-woman men, husbands of only one wife, a one-woman man, and good managers of their children and their household. So they need to be able to manage their children, as does the pastor. He needs to be able to manage his home. I want to repeat a couple quick things about what I said when I was talking about a pastor managing his house. A lot of parents don't manage their households properly today. They show a lot of love. They show no discipline. That's a problem. Or they show a lot of discipline, a strict disciplinarian, but they don't show affection to the kids. And it's important that both be present. A lot of love and a lot of discipline. One guy writes this: parental authority involves wise and nurturing guidance that will evoke devotion, affection, and loyalty in return. So God's love is a pattern for his own love that he displays to his children, and that includes love and discipline and consequences and so on. The children are respectful of his leadership because they have a real relationship with him. It's not a tyrant father who, through fear and intimidation, controls everything in his house. Neither is it a hypocritical father who lives one way at home and another way in front of people. And believe me, I've seen men who have done that. I've seen people who live, the double leve, as the Amish would call it, right? The double life. I've seen it. Guys who lived one way here and their home was completely different. Kids see through that stuff. Kids see through it. Kids will turn away from the Lord because of that stuff. They don't respect that. I'm convinced that a genuine, non-hypocritical walk with God is key. Good relationship with kids is invaluable. Kids recognize hypocrisy, and they will stop trusting what you say, and they'll if this is godliness, then I don't want any part of it. If you walk with the Lord and the kids see it, they'll respect that. They'll know that you love them. They'll know that you care for them. They know that you're on their side. They'll know that you're on God's side. And so a deacon needs to be biblically qualified. He needs to understand his office. He needs to have a biblical understanding of what is the nature of the office of a deacon. He needs to be a spiritual man. He needs to be full of God's Spirit and of wisdom. He needs to display integrity in his life. He needs to be tested. He needs to manage his marriage and his home in a godly way. And his wife needs to be along for the ride. Again, we've seen in the past, I've seen men who on all other fronts seem to be qualified to serve as a deacon, but the wife disqualifies him. I've seen it. The result of a deacon who follows these biblical qualifications, or I should say, whose character is, I'm not saying that right. I don't know how to say that sentence I want to say, but whose character reflects these biblical qualifications. The result of it is seen in verse 13. Look at verse 13. For those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a high standing. Those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a high standing and great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. So there's debate about what is this high standing? Is this the office itself? Is the high standing the office of a deacon? Is the high standing the reputation that comes along with this standing, the recognition that a deacon would attain to here on earth because of his position as a deacon? Is it the recognition that he would attain before God in eternity? And I would say, I don't know which one of those three, and I often don't know that we have to make a decision on it. I don't know why it couldn't be all of it. When you have a generic statement like he obtains a high standing, listen, the office of a deacon is a high standing. Yeah, it's a position of a table servant, but it's a high standing. Jesus says, he who is first will be last, right? He who wants to lead will serve. It is a high standing. A deacon who's biblically qualified and who's serving his position well ought to be recognized in the local church. And one day when he stands before God, he'll be recognized for that. So why doesn't it have to be all three? Why can't it be all three? Those who have served well as deacons obtain for themselves a high standing. And the second thing they obtain for themselves is a great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. His spiritual walk brings him confidence in the faith. His confidence in the faith brings about greater service. And when a deacon serves well, it benefits the church. It benefits the deacon. It benefits his house. It is so vital that a potential deacon or a current deacon be biblically qualified. It's not that he's perfect. No, he'll never be perfect. There is no human that exists apart from Jesus Christ, who is 100% God and 100% man. There is no human that exists that can attain remotely close to perfection, including pastors and deacons. Deacon is not perfect. It's that his life is characterized by a genuine walk with Jesus Christ. His life is consistent with his walk. He's full of the Spirit and of wisdom. And when that happens, the church functions as it should. The spiritual leaders can focus on their task. That is, those who are acting as pastors or the pastors can focus on prayer and the ministry of the word. And the deacons assist in that by freeing them up, by serving tables. It is a high office. That is a situation that's conducive to the church's growth. And it's a situation that's conducive, as we see in Acts chapter 6, that's conducive to the spreading of the gospel. And so the church, you guys, you are responsible for how you vote when it comes to the office of a deacon. You're responsible for who you vote in, because this is a congregationally run church, right? We are pastor-led, congregationally affirmed, right? That's what congregational government is. So we will lead in nominating men to serve. You guys affirm that or deny it by means of voting, all right? So you're responsible in how you see the office of pastor and the office of deacon, how you treat those offices, how you submit to the office of pastor, how you be discipled through the office of pastor, how you respect and recognize the office of a deacon. But it's not just that. It's more than that. As we're going through each of these characteristics, both of a pastor and for deacons, you are responsible to be this type of a person. It's not like, you know what? Those guys got to be that way, but I don't really have to be like that. And it's not that, this is talking about men, but, it's not talking about me as a lady. No, these characteristics are high qualifications for high offices. Qualifications that any Christian should attain to in their life, in their lives. You're responsible to be such a person. You're responsible to be a person of integrity. You're responsible to be a person of faith and wisdom. You're responsible for how you handle your marriage. You're responsible for how you handle your household. If you're a man, you're responsible for how you manage your home. If you're a lady, listen, the children are they're the ones that they're going to be trained by you most often. There isn't another person in this world. There's another person in this world that your kids, unless you send them off to public school, there's another person in this world that your kids are going to be influenced by more, time-wise, than the mother. More than the father, the mother, most often. Now, if both parents are out working and, that doesn't necessarily apply. But if you're following more of the traditional roles of a family where a man would go out and work and whatever else, and a woman would raise the children, that's what we've decided to do. We've decided to kind of follow that model we've seen in the Bible. There is no one my children see and interact with more than my wife. And so she is the number one influence, time-wise, on our children. So you're not exempt, ladies, from this. And even if you don't have children, or even if your children are grown or whatever, you can still be these characters. You could still have this character as a model to the younger women in the church. So this is not just for men. It's not just for officers. Yes, it's primarily for the officers of the church. Yes, it's primarily for pastors and for deacons, but it's for every person in the church. The deacons of a biblical church are table servants. They are table servants whose job is vital in a local church. And therefore, they must be biblically qualified men who understand the nature of their office. I got a word for the deacons before we close. It can be humbling going through a list of characteristics. It can be humbling going through a list of qualifications and being like, I'm not perfect in that area. I'm not perfect in that area. And I'm just gonna look, I get the feeling, I understand it, okay. This is not asking for, I'm talking to three guys, and three guys only right now. And anyone who's at home, whatever, who's a deacon, and maybe you're not at your church, you're listening later on. I understand that going through a series like this can be humbling. It can be challenging. I wouldn't have you guys serving in the office of a deacon if I didn't feel you were qualified to be such. So don't be so hard on yourself when you go through a passage like this. But I will also encourage you, if you see something that you're feeling conviction about, then respond to it. Then respond to that. And that's a good thing. Conviction is a good thing. It's a mechanism that God uses to bring us closer to Him. So I'm going to have Brother Paul come forward and close our service with an hymn. And if you're here and you're not sure that you're going to heaven when you die, most of this probably didn't mean much. Like, our church is not designed for so seekers. We're not a seeker-sensitive church so much. Like this is discipleship. This is for believers. If you're not sure you're going to heaven when you die, maybe you didn't understand a whole lot of this, or maybe a lot of it wasn't that important to you. But I'm going to tell you, you need to settle that matter before God today. I would encourage you to come to me and talk to me. I mean, you could die, and if you die today and you're standing before God, you're going to be in trouble. You want to settle that. There's only one way a person can be saved, and that's by faith and the completed work of Christ on the cross alone. Not by works of righteousness, which we have done, but according to His mercy. If you're here and you've heard, you're saved, you've heard some of these things, and you're like, I need to be this in my life. And you want to commit to being a person of these qualities, then you do that. While we sing, you pray before God, and you have access to God because of that one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. You can pray and have access to Jesus Christ as we sing right now. Brother Paul.